Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial named Basic Blender Particles Part 2. In Part 1 video tutorial, we looked at how Blender particles are generated and controlled. In this tutorial, we'll look at how particles are displayed and rendered. To demonstrate this, I've placed a plane object in my Blender scene. I have added to it an emitter particle system with the setting name of Demo2. I've set the timeline animation to 100 frames, the number of particles to 100, or 1 per frame, the start to -10, and the end to 100. Each particle has a lifetime of 20 frames, with a randomness lifetime of 0.3. That means 30% of the particles do not live 20 frames. The particles are emitted from the plane's object's face along the face normal with an initial velocity of 3. I am using Newtonian physics, and gravity is turned off in the scene editor. The scene is lighted by a sun lamp from one side and a dim hemi-lamp from the other side. In the particle system display panel, there are a number of settings that control how the particle is displayed in 3D viewport. By default, 100% of the generated particles are displayed in the 3D viewport. This can be adjusted with the display control. The panel also holds checkboxes to display size, velocity direction, and number. The 3D display size can also be adjusted. Here I will set the display size to 15. By default, the particles are displayed as squares, which is the 3D display for halos when using the render button in the display panel. If other types of particles are used, other than halos, the render button will give an indication of what is rendered. However, particles can be displayed in the 3D viewport as points, if something other than halos are used, circles, crosses, or small 3D axes. I'll go back to rendered, set the draw size back to 0, and uncheck the size and velocity checkboxes. But I'll leave the number checkbox. I'll go to frame 60 and render the scene. The particles are rendered as points of bright light with a halo effect around each point. Note also that the plane object is rendered. I will go to the Render panel and uncheck Render Emitter, and then re-render the scene. Now the emitter object is not rendered. The default type of particle, as noted in the Render panel, is a halo. These are called halos because you can see them, but they do not have any substance. They're like little clouds of light, although they are really not lights because they do not cast light into the scene like a lamp. However, they do light up themselves. That is, you do not need any additional lighting to see them when rendered. I'll set the number of particles to 1 and go to frame number 1 and render the scene. Our single particle is rendered as a halo. In the render panel, there is a controller named Trail Count that is set to 1 by default. I'll set the control to 2, and this opens up more controls. I'll set the length of the trailing particle to 0.225, and then go to frame number 2. Note in the 3D display, there is a second trailing particle below the original particle. I'll render the scene. The trailing particle is rendered along with the original particle. I'll add a third trailing particle and set the length to 0.2 and render the scene. There are now 3 rendered particles. Trailing particle counts are a way to increase the position and the mass of a particle system without changing the original number. I'll set the trail count back to the default 1 and go back to frame 1. and render the scene. The particle is rendered as a halo. Now, instead of a halo, particles can be rendered as lines. I'll select the Line button in the Render panel and render the scene. The Line Visualization Render mode creates, more or less, thin polygon lines with the Blender Strand Renderer in the direction of the particle's velocities. The thickness of the line is set with the parameter start of the Strands shader in the Materials Editor. The length of the line can be set by the back controller. I'll set the back from its default 0.5 to 0.1 and render the scene. The line has a somewhat thickened head, and I will set this controller to 0.1 and render the scene. Lines, in conjunction with the Strands shader, are often used to simulate rain. The Path Visualization Render mode is used with the hair-type particle system, and it's covered in a later video tutorial. Particles can also be rendered as objects. I'll go back to the 3D viewport. I'll add a UV sphere to the scene and scale it down a bit. And I'll name this object Ball. I'll smooth the ball object in the left tool panel, and I'll add a red material to the ball. I'll select the plane emitter, and in the Render panel, select the Object Visualization Render mode. I will click in the Duplicate Object box and select the ball object. I'll then render the scene. The particle is now rendered as the red ball object. I'll set the number of particles back to 100 and go to frame 60, and then render the scene. The emitted particles are now rendered as red balls. By default, the size of these object particles is set to 0.05. I will change this to 0.1 and render the scene. The object particles can also have a random size. I'll set the random controller to 0.5 and I'll render the scene. Now, half of the object particles are rendered at the random size, and half are rendered at the set size, 0.1. Particles can also be rendered as groups of objects. I'll go back to the 3D viewport, and I'll add a cone object. I'll smooth it, and I'll then add a yellow material. I'll go to the Object Editor, and in the Group panel, press the plus sign and create a new group called Particle Objects. I will add the cone object to the Particle Objects group. I'll select the red ball object and add this to the group as well. I now have two objects, the cone and the red ball, in a group called Particle Objects. I'll select the emitter object, and in the Render panel, select the Groups Visualization Render mode. In the Duplicate Group box, I will select the Particle Objects group, and then render the scene. The particles are now rendered as group objects. The group visualization mode has a number of settings that you might want to explore. In the Outliner panel, I'll hide and make unrenderable the ball and the cone objects. I'll select the last render visualization mode, Billboard, and render the scene. The billboard render visualization mode renders the particles as square planes, aligned to the camera by default. The billboard planes act like real Blender polygon objects in that they receive light and shadows. They can have UV textures and can be scaled. I'll go back to the default halo render visualization. Change the number of particles back to 1. Then go to frame number 1 and render the scene. The halo rendering of the particle is controlled by the halo settings in the material panel for the emitter plane object. I'll go to the 3D viewport and make sure that the emitter plane is selected. I'll then go to the materials editor and add a new material. I'll name this material Halo Render. As the material type, I'll select Halo. I'll click on the diffuse color swatch and create a light blue color. I'll then render the scene. The halo now has a light blue haze. I will set the halo alpha to 0.3 and render the scene. The halo is now very transparent. I will set the alpha back to 1 and set the size to 0.25 and then render the scene. The halo particle is less transparent and also 1/2 the size of the original. I'll set the halo particle size back to 0.5. Halos can be rendered in the default hazy fog surrounding a point of light, or as rings, lines, or star tips. I'll checkmark the Rings checkbox, and then click on the Rings diffuse color swatch, and create a pink color. I'll then render the scene. The halo is now rendered with rings. The number of rings can be set using the Rings controller. I'll set the number of rings to 8 and render the scene. I will uncheck Rings and checkmark Lines. Then click on the color swatch and create a light yellow. And then render the scene. The halo is now rendered with lines. The number of lines can be set using the Lines controller. I'll set the number of lines to 32 and render the scene. I will uncheck Lines and checkmark Star Tips and then render the scene. The halo is now rendered with star tips. The number of star tips can be set using the Star Tips controller. I'll set the number of star tips to 5 and render the scene. I will uncheck star tips, which will return to the default halo type, and render the scene. All halo types, default, rings, lines, and star tips, can have a flare added to them. A flare is an apparent sudden burst of energy or light. We sometimes see this as an artifact of a camera lens flare. I'll checkmark the flare checkbox, set the size to 0.5, and the boost to 10, and render the scene. I will uncheck the flare checkbox and go back to the particles editor. I'll set the number of particles to 100, and I'll go to frame 60 and render the scene. In this video tutorial, we have been rendering individual frames. It's important to keep in mind that particles are in motion over a series of frames, and each frame rendering is different. Here is an example of this particle system using the halo render visualization over 100 frames. In the next video tutorial, we'll look at common settings used to create different particle effects.